You have to remove the structural dependence on lands to your east. If you're looking for a way to free up options, which in a world that's changing, options are the best thing you can do, you need to make sure that your economic structure is not dependent on the reassertion of some pre-war environment, because that's not coming back. And even if it did, all that would do is put you back in the same position you're in. So that means largely removing natural gas from your fuel mix. Now, some people in Germany think you should do that for environmental reasons. I'm saying it's for security reasons, because right now you're dependent upon supplies from a hemisphere away, which is equally dangerous. That also means you need to turn your nuclear power plants back on. And that also means that your green community needs to make their peace with coal being your number one source of fuel for at least the next 20 years. Now, I would argue that the Green Party in Germany has already made their peace with coal. German carbon emissions, because of a lot of decisions you've made, are through the roof. They're going to stay high for decades. There's no way around that. Nuclear power plants are one of the few ways that you might be able to deal with that moving forward. But that also means that Germany's role as a major chemicals processor and producer is also over. Germans do high-end, precision-driven manufacturing. That is somewhat energy intensive. But if you remove the chemicals component, it's significantly less. Now that means you have to have an extra European partner. And the United States is the best short-term option there. I don't know if that's politically viable in Germany, but that is the least disruptive way for Germany to get some strategic flexibility. If you had asked me in January of 2021, I would have laughed. But you've already gone a long way, and honestly, you probably have the best possible governing coalition for this strategic situation, because the Social Democrats were traditionally the pro-Russia party. The Greens were never good at math. And the FDP is primarily concerned with smaller companies. And to have these three parties having to make these decisions means that there's no protest from within the parliament. That is a rare constellation of events that normally don't shape up in a time of national stress. To have the parties that are most resistant to the future you're obviously barreling towards in charge of bringing you into that future. If Ukraine wins, and it does so by neutralizing Belgorod and Rostov-on-Don, we're at the beginning of the Russian disintegration. Most of the infrastructure that allows the Russian core around Moscow to influence the Northern Caucasus, pre-Soviet, it routed through Ukraine. And the only other reliable route goes through Rostov-on-Don. And if they lose that, they are almost let me put this into European terms. There's a Utah-sized desert between the two. So that's bigger than Austria, about twice the size of Austria. No, three times the size of Austria. Crap, yeah, that's huge. And so their ability to protect, their ability to dictate the security environment of the Northern Caucasus would evaporate. And yes, we do have Kadyrov, who's that megalomaniac, psychopath, who runs Chechen forces today. But he does that because he has a security agreement with Putin personally.
Yeah.
If the Russian forces cannot penetrate into the North Caucasus, that'll evaporate in a day. And now all of a sudden the Russians have lost the entirety of their southern anchor. Once that goes down, every other minority in the Russian Federation is going to look good and hard on their map and good and hard at the Kremlin and figure out how much wiggle room they have. And some of those minorities have a lot more influence and are in positions that are very sensitive to the Russian state. For example, if the Tatars or the Bashkirs broke away, that would be it. Moscow would lose control of the entirety of Siberia, complete with all of the oil. So we really are looking at Russia's twilight years if this war goes the wrong way for them. The war was going to happen anyway. And if all of the states of the former Soviet bloc had remained neutral, that just meant it would have happened sooner. If they lose, the entire Russian government is in danger. The problem here is honestly the same no matter how this goes down. There was a coup in the Soviet Union in 1982 in which the intelligence directorates took over the Communist Party and ran the country until it fell apart. And then that cadre survived into the post-Cold War era, and Putin is the heir to that legacy. Also, in about 1986, the technical educational system in the Soviet Union fell apart and was never reconstituted, and it wasn't reconstituted in post-Soviet Russia either. So the entirety of the leadership cadre of today's Russian Federation is heir to those two problems. And it's only about 130 people. And they all see the world the same way. And Putin has purged it pretty much of anyone who might theoretically throw a coup. So, assuming for the moment that Putin were to die tomorrow, I don't think it would really matter for the war or the overall strategic aims. All of the people who are left in leadership see the world through more or less the same lens. Now, there would be probably a 3 to 6 month period where the remaining 130 people decide, who's going to be in charge, and that would be some valuable disruption time if you're Ukraine. But I don't think it fundamentally moves the needle. If Russia wins, well, honestly, that's a question for Berlin. Because what would probably happen is the Russians would get to the border of Warsaw and they would call up Stockholm and Berlin and Paris and London on a conference call and say, look, we know we can't match you on the field of battle. So we've already given the order. The nukes will launch tomorrow at noon. You have until then to forswear all defensive relationships with the Poles. They are not interested, except for maybe in buying time a little bit. Let me hit that in 3 pieces. First, and most importantly, I have no information that points fingers at anyone. So I personally do not know, and I do not know anyone who knows. And I've even been to Langley in the last few months, and they don't know.
Oh, okay,
officially anyway. So there's that. Number 2, the 2 dominant theories don't make much sense to me. So the first dominant theory, of course, is that the Russians did it to their own pipeline, but this was Russia's primary method of manipulating Germany, which they've done so effectively for so long, so that doesn't really hold water for me. The second theory is that the United States did it in order to make sure that the Europeans had no choice but to stand against the Russians. And I could have entertained that as of August 31st of last year. But on September 1, the Kremlin ordered Nord Stream shut down and publicly delivered an ultimatum to Berlin, basically saying, look, without this, you will deindustrialize and your entire economic model will fail. Or you can stab Ukraine in the back and pull out of the coalition supplying Ukraine, in which case we will turn it back on. You have to choose between being Western or modern. And the Americans were getting the hammer ready because from the last 30 years of German behavior, we thought we knew what the Germans were going to do. We thought they were going to side with the Russians again. And then they didn't. Germany chose to pay an incredibly steep economic and cultural price in order to protect its values. No one in the United States saw that coming, and that hammer got put down. So from the American point of view, everything that we could have ever asked of the Germans unexpectedly happened. And so we had no reason to blow it up. Now, my personal theory, and I have no information to back this up on the ground, is that it was Gazprom. Because the order to shut the pipeline off came from Moscow, not from Gazprom. And Gazprom contractually was now on the hook for paying the Germans for replacement supplies at whatever price the Germans had to pay to get those supplies. So, up by a factor of 8 almost overnight. But if force majeure kicked in, then that all goes away. So, that's my theory. Anyway, third and perhaps most importantly, the Swedes are 100% positive who did it. They say they've got proof. But if they provide proof that it was the Russians, then Europe has to cease trading completely with the Russians overnight, because you cannot have a trading partner that is targeting your critical infrastructure. And so the Swedes have been asked unofficially to sit on the information. They've been sitting on it now for almost 6 months. And the Danes also supposedly have information, and they're getting a little bit more antsy than even the Swedes, because, the Danes are already in NATO, whereas Sweden is still in the waiting room. So we're probably reaching a point fairly soon where some Scandinavian is going to leak this information out and force Berlin and Paris and the rest to do some very difficult things in a very short period of time. Luckily, the Europeans have had over a year now to cut their dependency upon the Russian space, and honestly, it's going a lot better than I had any reason to expect at the beginning. Hirsch's take is based on one interview with one unnamed source, and The way that it was outlined is not how the United States carries out special operations. So I'm going to put that in the category of absolute bullshit.
Yeah. Even when he has such a high reputation and he has nothing.
He has in the past. It has dwindled steadily over the decades. That is the concern in the United States, in London, and across Ukraine and all of Central Europe, is that the Germans will look for a way to go back to how things were. We're now at a point, I would argue, that even if the politics were right, the economics will never line up again. Most of the Russian commodities are produced in the permafrost. It's a territory that slows and buckles and bends, and the Russians cannot maintain that output in the long term without massive amounts of external funding and, more importantly, external labor, because their labor force is in a state of collapse. So the only way we can go back to 2020 in terms of energy and commodity supplies is if we have the war resolved, or at least settled overnight, and then someone steps forward with at least €1 trillion worth of investment, not for Ukraine, for Russia. I don't see that as being even remotely in the cards. German success these last 75 years has been based on 3 factors. Number one, a very high level of labor skill for precision manufacturing. Number two, access to various industrial bases throughout the European space in order to build a differentiated supply chain system for doing the parts of the labor system that are not as capital intensive and not as labor intensive and not as skill intensive. So basically, Poland is your Mexico, to oversimplify. And then third, a globalized system that allows the Germans to access low cost, high reliability, imported raw materials, especially energy, but also end markets that can absorb all of this product, because the Germans produce significantly more product than they could ever consume, not just at home, but in Europe as well. All 3 of those pillars are now gone. The German population has been aging for decades, and this was always going to be the decade that the bulge in the German population moves from the 50s and early 60s into mass retirement. So the labor force is no longer there. Second, the European system, that differentiated supply chain, most of the countries that Germany has integrated with have demographics that are just as bad. So Poland is actually aging faster than Germany. They're just a little bit younger. But the Netherlands is nearly as bad. Austria is nearly as bad. So the ability to maintain the production system from a labor point of view is going to get significantly weaker. And then probably third, most importantly, the Russian stuff's gone. It's not coming back. And as we've seen in the United States, people around the world are celebrating that it's Joe Biden and not Donald Trump. But with the exception, the one exception of Airbus, Boeing, that's spat. That one has been put to the side, partially resolved. With the exception of that, every trade dispute that Donald Trump initiated, Biden has doubled and tripled down on, and he's now putting industrial policy in the mix for the first time in the United States since the 1940s. And this means that the United States is no longer interested at all in maintaining the globalized system. The deal that made globalization work was that we will patrol the ocean so that anyone can trade with anyone and access anything, and we will leave our markets open if you let us write your security policies to fight the Soviets. You may have noticed in all of the deal making that the Biden administration has done around the world, and especially in Europe, that's not the deal anymore. All the security agreements are purely bilateral. There are no economic hangers-on. And Biden is taking the American economy home and basically shutting its doors to one region after another, and that includes Europe as well. And that leaves Germany with China. And if you think that your dependence upon Russia has generated some interesting geopolitical exposure, just wait till we get to a real argument between the Chinese and the Americans. There's an understanding in the world of environmental energy that you only put up wind turbines in places where the wind blows fairly strongly. There is not an understanding in the green community that you only put up solar panels in places where the sun shines brightly. So the location of these things really matters. Now, I live at roughly 2,300 meters in the highlands above what used to be called the Great American Desert in Colorado. That means that my solar panels generate 7 times as much electricity as the same panels would in Berlin. That means I'm in one of the world's best solar zones, and Berlin is in almost the world's worst. And if you're going to put up 7 times as much paneling in order to generate the same amount of electricity, you have now generated so much carbon by putting up those panels that you will never be able to generate enough electricity to pay down the carbon debt, much less the economic debt. It's just not a good geography for that technology. So that's problem one. Most of the population of the world lives in a place that is much more similar to Berlin than Denver, unfortunately. Number two, if we are serious about doing the green transition in its current form with the current technologies that we have, then we need more materials than we currently have, and we have to be able to process them. So in terms of volume, we need 10 times as much nickel, 18 times as much graphite, probably 3 times as much copper, and we need it all by 2030. We have never doubled the volume of any industrial material in human history, if it's something that we already had in use, ever. And we now need to do this and then some for 11 different materials. That is not physically possible. And then there's a processing issue. Right now, it depends, it varies wildly based on the material. Roughly 3/4 of the processing of these 11 different materials is done in either Russia or China. We're going to lose the Russia stuff in total because of economic breakdown. And in my opinion, we're going to lose a lot of the Chinese stuff due to political breakdown. Simply taking silicon, building that processing capacity somewhere outside of China can be done, but it's going to almost triple the price of silicon because the Chinese subsidize everything. So all of our price metrics that we've done are wrong. But the real issue is availability. Oil, we understand the economics and the geopolitics of the oil era. It means you have to deal with a lot of different places that are kind of ugly. But if we want to do the energy transition, not only do we have to deal with a lot more places that are ugly, there's not enough for everyone. One of the great parts of globalization is the United States kept the world's petroleum market open for everyone. We didn't get involved in the Middle East because we thought it was fun. We didn't even get involved in the Middle East because we needed the crude. We got our crude from North America. We did it for Germany and France and Italy and Korea and Japan and even China. We kept the world's energy flowing because that was part of the globalization deal. There's not enough lithium and copper and the rest to do that on a global basis. So if you're looking at American military interventionism to keep copper and nickel and the rest flowing, it will be to keep it flowing to North America. The green transition in its current form cannot be done on a global basis, but it can be done in North America if the Americans invade about 15 places to keep the stuff going there. The Greens in this country have yet to realize that that is the conversation that they need to have.
Would you reactivate the nuclear power
Yes.
plants? Okay.
That's the simplest, easiest step. There are many, many other steps that are much more difficult, that are much more jarring, but that's the low-hanging fruit. And Germany probably needs to take a page from the U.S. state of Wisconsin. I don't think the German manufacturing model can continue in its current form for a number of reasons, but that doesn't mean that there is no manufacturing model that might work. So Wisconsin is part of our old Rust Belt. They used to build the cars and the machinery. Now they do a lot of precision work for components that are then flown to other locations for assembly. Now, Germany is a really big country to do that at scale, but if we're moving into a world where supply chains for manufacturing break down on a global basis, the need for the difficult to get parts, I'm thinking transmissions here, for example, for automotive, is going to skyrocket. And Germany's skill set is much more appropriate to that role than the kind of the mass manufacturing capacity that we've become used to in the past.